Welcome back. Last time we talked about how the US was a society with high living standards between 1945 and 1970, how exogenous economic shocks led people to misinterpret why their living standards were falling, and how between 1980 and 2025, the US embraced policies that drove down living standards for the average American and drove income up for CEOs and wealthy families. Today, I want to introduce the big boogeyman of this series. I call it wealth concentration. Some people talk about this in terms of wealth inequality, but I prefer wealth concentration because the term feels less loaded and more accurate. The problem isn't so much inequality per se, but the extreme level of concentration at the top. For example, if the top 10% owned 30% of all the wealth, this would be unequal, but the concentration isn't extreme. On the other hand, if the top 10% owned 70% of the wealth, which coincidentally is the case in the United States, then that concentration is extreme. And these extreme concentrations, as I will show, are driving living standards down. Now, as we go through this, I want you to keep something in mind. When wealth concentrates at the top, it doesn't just move money around on some spreadsheets. It impacts the physical and emotional realities of ordinary families, okay? So let's start by talking about how wealth became so concentrated. We talked last time about how policy changes in the 1980s resulted in wages stagnating for average workers, but increasing dramatically for CEOs. We said last time that compared to CPI, real wages rose by 12% between 1980 and 2025. However, real wages for CEOs rose by about 1,200%. In other words, CEO pay rose 12 times faster than employee wages. More importantly than that, asset values rose much faster than wages and even faster than CEO pay. For example, assuming you reinvested all your dividends, the value of the S&P 500 rose by about 3,000% in real dollars. In other words, the value of assets increased about 28 times faster than wages. So why did CEO pay and asset values rise so much faster than wages? Let's start by talking about deregulation. Prior to 1980, the US had a regulatory framework designed to maintain competition. Now, competition is good because when companies compete for customers, they have to lower their prices, improve their quality, or offer some other sort of incentive. In short, when there's a lot of competition in a market, customers and skilled employees benefit. After 1980, a lot of the regulations designed to increase competition and prevent monopolies were rolled back. Bigger companies started merging and buying up smaller companies. For example, there used to be more than a dozen airlines operating in the US. Now, because of corporate mergers and acquisitions, there are 4 airlines: American, Delta, United, and Southwest. And these 4 airlines control 80% of the air travel in the United States. When you have a small number of firms that control most of a sector, this is called an oligopoly. The problems with oligopolies are pretty much the same as the problem with monopolies. They reduce competition, which drives prices up. This is because people only have so many options when it comes to buying a plane ticket. If all of the airlines have high prices and refuse to lower them, then you can either pay the high price or you don't get to fly. A parallel problem with corporate consolidation is that it creates monopsony. A monopsony is when a number of firms control the majority of jobs in a particular sector. For instance, if you are a pilot, you're going to have a hard time finding a commercial job in the US outside of one of those 4 major airlines. In a monopsony, workers compete with each other for jobs, which drives wages down. So all in all, the deregulation of the airline industry had the effect of pushing prices up for consumers, wages down for workers, and profits up for owners. And airlines are just one example. The same sort of thing happened in telecommunications, banking, and media sectors, just to name a few. And in each case, deregulation led to mergers and acquisitions until only a few corporations existed in the sector. These corporations acted as both oligopolies and monopsonies. They ultimately drive living standards down while driving asset prices up, and this creates wealth concentration. Another trend that started to emerge in this new era of deregulation were what we call anti-competitive labor practices. I'll mention a few of them. The first is something you've probably heard of called a non-compete clause. This is basically a contract that companies make new employees sign, which says that if the employee leaves the company, he or she may not work for a competitor for a certain period of time. The impact of these clauses is that the employee loses all bargaining power to negotiate a raise. If you signed a non-compete, and then you go ask your boss for a raise, and he says no, what are you going to do? You can't leave to work for a company that'll pay you more. You signed a non-compete. This was one way companies held wages down. Another thing companies sometimes did was to work together in secret to keep wages down. For example, they signed no poaching agreements with each other, meaning that they agreed not to hire workers from one another. This held wages down in a similar way to the non-compete agreements. Employees have no leverage to negotiate a raise if the competition is forbidden from hiring them. Now, during this time of deregulation, companies started seeking profits at all costs. And the biggest barrier to profits is often the cost of employees. In order to avoid having to pay for things like employee healthcare, pensions, and taxes, many companies reduced their number of full-time employees and replaced these jobs with part-time and contract, or what we now call gig work. This shifted the burden for things like healthcare and retirement savings from employers onto employees, which of course did the two things that we keep coming back to: increasing wealth concentration at the top and reducing living standards for working people. Next, let's talk about stock buybacks. Prior to the 1980s, stock buybacks were illegal. But remember, legislators were deregulating basically every industry at this time, and the financial sector was no exception. So what are stock buybacks? When a company makes profits, they can do several things with this money. The most obvious would be to reinvest this profit into the company itself. This might be buying a new building, increasing wages to attract or retain talent, or upgrading their machinery. The other things they can do with it are to return it to the shareholder in the form of a dividend or buy back their stock from the market. Prior to 1980, companies generally chose the first option, which was to reinvest profits into the company in the form of expansion, upgrades, or worker wages. But after 1980, everything was about maximizing shareholder value. And remember that every dollar not spent on wages is a dollar that can be turned into a dividend or used for a stock buyback. Now, the way stocks work is that the value of a stock is determined by the prices at which other people are willing to buy and sell it. When companies buy large quantities of their own stock, it drives stock prices up, because the purchase is telling the market the demand for the stock is high. Basically, stock buybacks increase the value of the stock, which is profitable for anyone who owns the stock prior to the buyback. Now, who owns stocks? In the US, the top 10% of wealthy people own 93% of all stock. So in effect, a stock buyback is a way to transfer money from a company to the company's owners. And since they're not technically being paid, they don't have to pay income tax on this increase in their asset values. And guess what else? Companies don't even need to have the money on hand to do a stock buyback. They can take out a loan and use that money for the buyback. This is called a leveraged recapitalization. The downside of all this is that the loan is eventually going to have to be repaid. This weakens the company balance sheets and makes it difficult for workers to negotiate raises since the company is now in debt. It also makes the company more vulnerable because it has less capital to deploy in the event of a significant shock to the market. This reduces job security for workers because financial problems could cause the company to have to downsize or become bankrupt. All this is to say that the new trend of stock buybacks had the net effect, once again, of driving wages for workers down and driving asset prices up. Now, I know we've talked about the minimum wage before, but I need to mention it again because it's important to understand how it can amplify wealth concentration. As we've discussed, the minimum wage has lost about 40% of its purchasing power since the 1980s. But on top of this, the minimum wage sets the floor for wage compensation throughout the economy. If the minimum wage is low, like it is now, then wages just above the minimum stay low as well. Employers don't have to pay much more to compete with the minimum wage. But when the minimum wage increases, employers can no longer pay more experienced workers the same amount that they're paying someone who just started yesterday. The floor for wages rises, and it pulls wages for the entire lower tier of wage earners up. What it does not do is increase wages for CEOs or raise asset prices. So, if you were to increase the minimum wage, you would reduce wealth concentration and increase living standards. Okay, back to the changes that happened in the 1980s. All of this created a divergence in rates of wealth accumulation. People who were already wealthy had their money in assets, while working people had their money in cash or home equity, which was the only asset that most people had. This created what economists called a K-shaped economy. The value of assets has gone up, while the purchasing power of wages has gone down. What's important to understand here is that at any one time, there is a finite amount of resources in the economy. The money supply may expand, but that doesn't mean that the number of real purchasable resources has expanded. Think of it like a pie. If the wealthiest 10% are taking a bigger slice of the pie, then there is less to go around for the other 90%. And since asset prices are rising faster than wages, the top 10% slice of the pie gets bigger and bigger every year, leaving less and less for everyone else. The next thing that's important to understand is that ordinary people and very wealthy people have different marginal propensities to spend. What I mean by this is that ordinary people spend most of their wages on goods and services. Let's assume someone makes $60,000 a year. With a monthly income of $5,000, they'll spend almost all of it on things like rent, utilities, food, clothing, and other things that they need or want. They don't usually have very much left over to invest. Someone making $60,000 a year might be able to invest $6,000 or 10% of their income. Now, the situation for wealthy people is very different. There are extremely wealthy people who make much more money than this in the form of asset appreciation, business profits, or other passive sources of income. There are hundreds of billionaires in the United States. Some of them have many billions of dollars, but for our example, let's just assume one person with a net worth of $1 billion. If this wealthy person's assets grew at only 5% annually, which is actually a bit low by historical standards, their net worth would increase by $50 million in a year. Now, this person could live a life of luxury for less than $1 million per year. So after all their expenses, they still have $49 million left over that year. So what do they do with it? They buy more assets. In effect, the person making $60,000 per year is able to invest 10% of their income, while the person making $50 million per year is able to invest 96% of their income. This is why we say that ordinary people primarily buy goods and services, while wealthy people primarily buy assets. This is also why the more money you have, the easier it is to make money. Hopefully now you can see how wealth concentration compounds on itself and can cause the sort of runaway effect which allows the top 10% to take an increasingly larger share of the total wealth each year. Another thing to understand is that the nominal value of your wage is not as important to determining your living standards as the value of your wage relative to the total value of the economy. In other words, if you get a 5% raise in wages, but asset prices are increasing by 10%, then practically speaking, your relative purchasing power has decreased. Here's an example to demonstrate this. Let's say you make $50,000 a year and you get a 5% raise. So this year you'll be making $52,500. However, the house you wanted to buy cost $300,000 last year, but has since appreciated by 10% to $330,000. So even though you got a raise, the house you want to buy has become more expensive in real terms. If you're wondering why this is happening, by the way, it's because wealthy people are purchasing housing and treating it like an asset. The wealthiest 10% of the US population own about 45% of all the housing. This is just one mechanism by which increasing wealth concentration reduces living standards for ordinary people. So, to summarize, dramatic policy changes in the 1980s resulted in significant concentration of wealth for people at the top and significantly eroded living standards for people at the bottom. This graph is a little bit old and only goes back to 1989, but I think it gets the point across. The top 10% of US households controlled 44% of the country's wealth before all these policy changes. By 2023, this same 10% controlled 67% of the country's wealth. I really don't know an easier way to explain it than this. If the country's wealth is concentrated at the top, that means there's less to go around for everyone else. Young adults are financially drowning, and these economic conditions triple the likelihood that they'll have a depressive episode. So now you know why wealth concentration has been increasing, how growing concentrations of wealth lead to even greater concentrations of wealth, and how this concentration is driving living standards down and rates of depression and mental illness up. And look, I know this all sounds a bit bleak, but none of this is set in stone. This is all the result of policy choices, and that means that these policies can be changed. The next video will talk about what needs to be done in order to fix this broken system and how we can improve living standards so that our children don't have to feel so anxious and depressed. That's all the time we have for our session today. I'll see you next week.